One of the areas that gets a lot of talk these days is aviation's impact up with the environment. I think it was in November, you wrote a really thoughtful piece about the challenges aviation and climate policymakers are facing, and sometimes making pledges that are unlikely to be achievable.
Yes.
So what's going to happen if technology is unable to meet the goals or those targets that some of these policymakers are coming up with?
That's the challenge facing all sectors of the economy, but aviation in particular, because it looks to be very, very hard for aviation to get to zero without crippling reductions in size and scope. And I think the cost of that to the world economy is just too awful to bear. So I think the first lesson is that aviation needs to start talking to and listening to economists, because economists have a different view. The standard view is that every sector must get down to zero, no matter what it costs. And that is a recipe for making economies poor. It's obviously important to do as much as we can on global warming, but what economists suggest is we look at each sector and the various kinds of measures that could be taken to reduce the carbon footprint. And you can calculate the cost per 1,000 tons and look for first the low-hanging fruit. The stuff you can do for $10 a 1,000 tons, well, that we're going to do with all deliberate speed. The stuff when you get to $100 a ton, well, okay, yes, probably a lot of that makes sense and should be done. When you're looking at $1,000 a ton, all of a sudden you've got to say, now wait a minute, let's look at the benefits, what the losses of what we would have in terms of higher cost and reduced service and so forth if we actually went that way. And what this boils down to, when you get to a lot of those very high-end cost per ton things, it really starts making the case for reducing CO2, in other words, what's called negative emissions. Large-scale agricultural techniques that reduce the emissions from farming, large-scale enhancement of the forest tree cover of the globe. That takes a while for forests to grow, but if we start in the next 10 years, by 2030, by 2200, God, I mean by the next end of the century, we will have a much bigger tree cover that and big studies have shown large-scale impacts on the Earth's CO2 output for all these large amounts of trees sucking things up. And carbon capture and sequestration is still it's still very costly, but more R&D on that really makes sense to see if we can come up with ways that can do that at a realistic cost per ton reduced. So that's the general picture, and that's what it's a summary of the article that I wrote, I think. But aviation is not in that conversation. Bill Gates wrote a whole book that includes this point of view. McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group have done studies. Magazines like The Economist have written long pieces about the need for this kind of approach. Aviation needs to get in that conversation, and it's not. It's simply buying the standard view, which is not going to do the job.